The ceramic cup hit the counter with a dull, deliberate thud that didn't match the usual rhythm of the morning rush. Usually, the exchange is fluid, a slide, a nod, a retreat. Today, the movement stopped dead. Aurora didn't pull her hand back. Her knuckles brushed against mine, the contact sudden and electric against the cool glaze of the mug. Then, she did something that felt like a shout in a quiet room. She reached out with her index finger and dragged it slowly through the perfect rosetta she had just poured into the foam, breaking the symmetry, ruining the art. Her eyes locked onto mine, dark, unamused, and terrifyingly direct. "Stop coming here if you won't look at me," she said. The noise of the espresso machine seemed to cut out instantly, leaving only the echo of her challenge hanging in the steam. To understand why that sentence hit like a structural failure in a load-bearing wall, you have to understand the architecture of the last 6 months. I am a creature of habit, and this cafe had become my sanctuary, my office, and my hiding place. For 180 days, give or take the weekends, I have walked through those glass doors at 10 a.m. sharp. I order a flat white, oat milk, no sugar. I take the small round table in the corner, the one with the wobbly leg that I prop up with a folded napkin, and I open my laptop. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed system. The cafe acted as a neutral zone, a demilitarized strip of land where the rules of engagement were strictly defined by commerce and caffeine. I paid for the coffee, she provided it. That was the contract. But beneath the surface of that transaction, there was a current running that we both pretended to ignore. It was a frequency only we seemed to hear. Aurora was the center of that system. I watched her from behind the safety of my screen, treating my work like a blind while I tracked her movements. She wasn't just a barista. She was a master of the machine. There is a specific kind of beauty in watching someone who is entirely competent at their job. She moved with an economy of motion that was hypnotic, tamping the grounds with a sharp twist of her wrist, purging the steam wand with a quick hiss, sliding the portafilter into the group head without ever looking down. She was efficient, skilled, and guarded. She wore her apron like armor, the canvas straps crossing a back that remained straight and unyielding, even during the wildest rushes. I told myself I was just people watching. I told myself that the way my eyes drifted to her hands, strong, capable, often stained with coffee grounds, was just boredom. But that was a lie, and on some level, I think we both knew it. The tension wasn't in what we said, it was in the silence we carefully maintained. It was in the glances. You know the ones. The look that lingers a fraction of a second too long when you hand over a credit card. The way she would glance up at my table when the door chimed, checking to see if I was still there, before snapping her attention back to the grinder. These weren't accidental collisions of sight. They were data points. I was mapping her, and she was mapping me. But we never acknowledged the survey. We treated the counter like a border that couldn't be crossed. I stayed on my side, the observant customer with the noise-canceling headphones and the serious expression. She stayed on hers, the professional gatekeeper of the espresso machine. It felt safe. It felt controlled. It allowed me to feel the pull of attraction without the terrifying risk of rejection or complication. I had convinced myself that this was enough. I had convinced myself that I could live in this state of suspended animation indefinitely, feeding on the low-level hum of desire without ever having to ground the circuit. It was a fragile construct, built on the assumption that she was playing by the same rules, that she was content to be the object of a silent, safe admiration. I thought we were both agreed on the script. I watch, she works, and nobody says a word about the air thickening between us. But safety is often just a lack of information. I didn't know that while I was safely hidden behind my screen, analyzing the slope of her shoulders, she was losing patience with the game. I didn't realize that the silence I found comforting, she found deafening. The routine I used as a shield, she saw as a wall. And walls, eventually, are meant to be breached. When she traced that line through the foam, she wasn't just ruining a coffee. She was tearing down the entire carefully curated reality I had lived in for half a year. The regular customer didn't exist anymore. The safety of the routine had evaporated the moment her finger touched the foam, leaving me exposed, seen, and suddenly, frantically awake. Let's freeze the frame right there. Let's go back to the tactile reality of that second, because the memory is burned into my nervous system with the clarity of a high-contrast photograph. The moment Aurora's finger broke the surface tension of the microfoam, the physics of the room seemed to warp. You have to understand the violation of protocol here. In the service industry, there are invisible lines drawn in permanent marker. You don't touch the customer. You certainly don't touch the product once it has been presented. And you absolutely never destroy the aesthetic perfection you just spent 30 seconds creating. But she did. She traced a line right through the center of the rosetta, dragging the white foam into the dark crema, turning a symbol of professional excellence into a chaotic smear. It was vandalism. It was deliberate. And it was the hottest thing I had ever seen. The sensory details of that moment hit me all at once, bypassing my logical brain and wiring directly into the lizard part of my mind that deals with desire and danger. I could smell the sharp, acidic tang of the espresso, the sweetness of the oat milk, and beneath it, the faint, metallic scent of the machine she had been working on all morning. I could feel the heat radiating from the ceramic cup, a dull warmth against my palm where I had instinctively reached out to take it. But mostly, I felt her. Her hand didn't just hover, it lingered. When she reached out to ruin the art, the side of her hand brushed against my knuckles. It wasn't a collision, it was a calibration. Her skin was warm, dry, and rough, the kind of roughness that comes from handling hot portafilters and washing hands 50 times a shift. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in the relative time of our relationship, it felt like an epoch. It was a transfer of energy, a direct line of communication that said more than 6 months of polite nods ever could. It was a shock to the system, a jolt of static electricity that snapped the tether of my composure. My physiological reaction was immediate and embarrassing. My heart didn't just speed up. It kicked into a frantic, heavy rhythm, thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The blood rushed to my face, a sudden flush of heat that I prayed the dim lighting of the cafe would hide. It was a classic fight-or-flight response, but my body had chosen a third option: freeze. I stood there, paralyzed, my hand still touching the cup, my eyes locked on hers. The cafe around us was loud. The grinder was whining its high-pitched protest. The milk steamer was screaming, and the indie folk playlist was drifting from the overhead speakers. But in that bubble of space across the counter, there was a vacuum of silence. The only sound I could hear was the echo of her voice, dropped an octave lower than her usual customer service pitch. "Stop coming here if you won't look at me." It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. It was a challenge, issued by someone who was tired of being an object of passive observation. She was demanding presence. She was demanding that I step out from behind the safety of the regular customer persona and actually engage with the reality of the woman standing in front of me. She was calling my bluff. I don't remember picking up the cup. My motor functions must have taken over on autopilot, executing the familiar program of take coffee, find table. I remember the weight of the mug in my hand feeling heavier than usual, like I was carrying a live grenade instead of a latte. I turned away from the counter, my legs feeling strangely unsteady, like I had just stepped off a boat onto dry land. Walking to my table felt like crossing a stage under a spotlight. I could feel her eyes on my back. I didn't have to turn around to know she was watching. The sensation was physical, a prickling heat between my shoulder blades. I navigated the maze of chairs and laptop cords, the familiar path suddenly treacherous. When I finally reached my corner, my safe harbor, I set the cup down with a rattle that betrayed the tremor in my hands. I sat down, but the sanctuary was gone. The wobbly table was the same, the view of the street was the same, but the air had changed. The oxygen felt thinner. I looked down at the coffee. The phone was still separated where her finger had dragged through it, a scar in the milk. I hadn't even taken a sip, and I was already completely intoxicated. The protocol was broken. The deviation had occurred, and there was absolutely no going back to the safety of silence. I sat there, staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in Aramaic. The cursor blinked at me, a rhythmic, mocking pulse that kept perfect time with the erratic thumping of my heart. I tried to type. I really did. I managed to draft 3 emails that I immediately deleted because they sounded like the incoherent ramblings of someone suffering from a minor electrical short. The work was gone. My brain had completely reallocated its resources. The logic centers were offline, the firewall was down, and the sensory processing centers were running at 200% capacity. My laptop screen was just a light source now, a rectangle of white noise I used to hide the fact that I was doing exactly what she had just accused me of, watching her. But the dynamic had shifted tectonically. Before, I watched her like a naturalist observing a rare bird, quiet, respectful, hidden in the brush. Now, I was watching her like a gambler watching the roulette wheel spin, knowing I had put my life savings on red and the ball was starting to slow down. Aurora was in the weeds. The mid-morning rush had bled into the lunch rush, a relentless tide of caffeine-deprived professionals demanding complex modifications to simple drinks. I watched her navigate the chaos from the safety of my peripheral vision. It was like watching a drummer in the pocket of a complex jazz standard. She didn't rush, she flowed. Her movements were a series of perfectly executed percussions, the sharp thwack of the portafilter against the knockbox, the aggressive hiss of the steam wand purging water, the delicate clink of ceramic on saucer. She was efficient, yes, but there was a sharpness to her movements today, a kinetic energy that felt dangerous. She moved like someone who was trying to burn off excess fuel. I noticed the stark difference in how she handled the other customers. She gave them the service smile, that bright, polished expression that lifts the corners of the mouth but doesn't quite reach the eyes. She was polite, she was charming, she laughed at their bad jokes about the weather. But every time the line thinned, even for a fraction of a second, her eyes would snap to my corner. She didn't smile at me. She didn't offer the polite mask. She gave me something raw, something heavy. It was a look that stripped away the noise of the room and left just the two of us suspended in the static. It was a look that said, "I know you're still there." I looked down at my cup. The foam had settled, the ruined rosetta now just a shapeless blob of white in the tan liquid. I took a sip. It was cold. I realized then that my hands were shaking, and for once, I couldn't blame the caffeine. I hadn't had enough of it yet to justify the tremors. This wasn't a chemical reaction to a stimulant. It was a biological reaction to proximity. It was the feeling of sitting 10 feet away from a live wire that had just sparked. The jitters weren't in my blood. They were in the air. The atmosphere of the cafe usually faded into the background for me, a pleasant white noise of commerce that helped me focus. Today, everything was amplified. The high-pitched whine of the grinder sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. The clatter of spoons on saucers sounded like gunshots. The indie folk playlist, usually a soothing backdrop of acoustic guitars and whispery vocals, felt mocking in its gentleness. I was vibrating. I was sitting in a comfortable chair in a climate-controlled room, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff in a gale-force wind. Time became elastic. The minutes stretched and compressed strangely. I watched the light shift across the floorboards as the afternoon wore on. The line at the counter dwindled. The suits went back to their offices. The students packed up their textbooks. The noise level dropped, layer by layer, until the aggressive hum of the espresso machine became the dominant sound again. I should have left. A rational person would have packed up their bag, nodded politely, and exited the situation to process the data in safety. But I couldn't move. I was anchored to that wobbly table by a mixture of fear and curiosity. She had issued a challenge, and leaving would have been a forfeiture. So I stayed. I waited as the shadows lengthened and the cafe emptied, leaving us alone in the quiet. The transition from a public thoroughfare to a private enclosure happens in stages, a slow dismantling of the day's performance. It started with the sign. At 6 p.m. exactly, the other barista, a new guy whose name I had never bothered to learn, walked to the front door. He unlocked the glass, flipped the plastic placard from open to closed, and locked it again. That simple mechanical action changed the physics of the room. The cafe was no longer a place of business. It had ceased to be a neutral zone where I could hide behind the anonymity of a transaction. It was now a cage, and I was the only one left inside who didn't have a key. I watched the process from my corner, feeling like a trespasser in a museum after hours. The ritual of closing was efficient and practiced. The new guy swept the floor, the bristled broom hissing against the polished concrete, pushing the day's debris into a pile. Aurora stayed behind the counter, dismantling the espresso machine. I watched her pull the drip trays, her movements sharp and final. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was systematically erasing the traces of the hundreds of people who had passed through the space, stripping the room down to its bones. Then came the exodus. The new guy shouted a goodbye, grabbed his backpack from the back room, and pushed out through the front door. The bell chimed once, a lonely, singular note that hung in the air for too long, and then the door swung shut. I watched him walk past the window, headphones already on, disappearing into the evening crowd. And then there was silence. It wasn't the quiet of a library, which feels studious and shared. This was the silence of a vacuum. The indie folk playlist had cut out 10 minutes ago, leaving only the ambient hum of the refrigerators and the low, rhythmic gurgle of the dishwasher in the back. The sensory landscape shifted violently. The rich, warm smell of roasted coffee that usually permeated the air was being overtaken by the sharp, sterile scent of industrial lemon cleaner and bleach. The lights, which had been bright and welcoming all day, seemed to dim. Or maybe it was just the sun setting outside, turning the floor-to-ceiling windows into mirrors. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the closed lid of my laptop. I was acutely aware of the power dynamic shifting under my feet. Technically, I was loitering. Technically, I should have been asked to leave 10 minutes ago. But no request came. The invitation to stay was implicit, written in the fact that she hadn't wiped down my table, hadn't made eye contact, hadn't told me to pack up. I was being kept. Aurora moved from behind the counter, walking to the front door. She didn't look at me as she passed. She moved with a proprietary confidence, the stride of someone who owns the space the moment the last customer leaves. She reached up and threw the deadbolt. The sound was distinct, a heavy metallic clack of steel sliding into the strike plate. It was a sound of finality. It severed the connection to the sidewalk, to the street, to the safety of the public world. My heart hammered erratic rhythm against my ribs. That click was the point of no return. Until that moment, I could have stood up, apologized for losing track of time, and fled. Now, I was sealed in. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air pressure dropping as if a storm front had just moved in. I was alone in a locked room with the source of 6 months of silent, agonizing tension. She turned away from the door, the keys jingling softly as she shoved them into her apron pocket. She didn't return to the safety of the machine. She walked slowly back through the empty maze of chairs, her boots heavy on the floorboards. She grabbed a rag from a bus tub, the white terry cloth stained with espresso, and wiped her hands. The action was slow, deliberate. She was cleaning off the work, shedding the layer of service she wore for the public. She stopped 10 feet away, then 5. The distance between us, which had been a vast ocean of counter space and professional protocol for half a year, evaporated. She walked right up to my table, the wobbly one in the corner, and stopped. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a customer service platitude. She just stood there, wiping her hands, looking down at me with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and hunger. The safety of the day was gone. The night had begun. Aurora didn't sit. That would have implied a level of social equality, a casual chat between friends, and we were far past the point of casual. Instead, she leaned her hip against the high back of the empty wooden chair opposite mine. She crossed her arms over her chest, the muscles in her forearms flexing slightly as she gripped her own elbows. It was a posture of relaxed dominance, casual but imposing, like a predator that has finally cornered its prey and is deciding whether to play with it or simply eat it. She let the silence stretch for a moment, just long enough for my pulse to hammer a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. She was studying me, not with the polite deference of a barista, but with the sharp, analytical gaze of someone stripping away a disguise. "You know," she said, her voice low and rough, the professional polish completely sanded away. "For someone who pretends to be so busy, you haven't typed a single word in 45 minutes. I felt the heat rise up my neck, a betrayal of my physiology. "I'm thinking," I managed to say, though the words sounded thin and unconvincing in the empty, chemically scented room. "You're hiding," she corrected. A small, sharp smile touched the corner of her mouth, not reaching her eyes. "And you're terrible at it." She reached out and tapped the back of my laptop lid with one finger. Tap, tap. The sound was loud in the quiet cafe. "This isn't a shield, it's a window. You think because you put those noise-canceling headphones on, I can't see where your eyes go? You think because you stare at the reflection in the pastry case instead of looking at me directly, I don't feel it?" The air between us felt thick, viscous. I could smell her now, really smell her. It wasn't just the generic aroma of the shop. It was specific to her. It was the scent of scorched sugar and vanilla syrup clinging to the canvas of her apron, mixed with the dark, oily roast of the beans. But underneath those layers was something sharper, something human, the salt of her skin, the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. It was the scent of 8 hours of labor and heat. It was warm and lived in, and it made my mouth water in a way the coffee never had. "I don't know what you mean," I lied. It was a weak defense, a paper wall erected against a tank, and we both knew it. Aurora laughed, a short, dry sound that bounced off the hard surfaces of the room. "Don't insult me. We've been playing this game for 6 months. You come in at 10, you sit at this wobbly table, you open this laptop, you watch me steam milk, you watch me wipe the counters, you watch me talk to every customer who isn't you." She leaned in closer, invading the airspace over the table, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a physical touch. "And I watch you watching me." The admission hung there, vibrating in the space between us. She had said the quiet part out loud. The plausible deniability, the safety net of my regular customer status, was gone. "You watch me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could vet it for cool detachment. "Every day," she said simply. Her eyes dropped to my lips, then snapped back up to my eyes, unrepentant. "I know your order before you walk in the door. I know you hate the jazz playlist on Tuesdays because your jaw gets tight. I know you wear that blue sweater when you're stressed." She tilted her head, her gaze dissecting me. "And I know you don't come here for the coffee." She gestured to the cold cup sitting next to my laptop. The foam was separated, the liquid stagnant and unappealing. "You drink maybe half of that, every single day. It's a waste of good oat milk." "Maybe I just like the atmosphere," I tried, clinging to the last shred of the charade. "The atmosphere," she repeated, tasting the word like a bad shot of espresso. "Is that what we're calling it? This tension?" She pushed off the chair, standing to her full height. The playful teasing was sharpening into something urgent. Every sentence felt like she was walking me toward a ledge I had been skirting for months. "I'm tired of the atmosphere," she said, the humor vanishing. "I'm tired of the polite nodding. I'm tired of making you coffee that you let go cold because you're too busy tracking my hands to drink it." She looked at the counter, then back at me, a challenge sparking in her dark eyes. "You want to know what I do back there? You want to stop guessing and actually see?" "Yes," I whispered. "Then get up," she commanded. She turned and walked back toward the espresso machine, not waiting to see if I followed. Bring your cup. If you're going to waste my product, you're at least going to learn how to make it properly." She stopped at the gap in the counter, the employee-only entrance. She looked back, waiting. It was an invitation to cross the boundary line, to step out of the safe zone and into the heat. Stepping behind the counter felt like stepping backstage at a theater, or maybe into the engine room of a ship. The floor changed instantly from polished concrete to thick industrial rubber mats that gave slightly under my boots, absorbing the sound of my arrival. The perspective shifted with a jarring finality. The cafe, which had always felt spacious and airy from my corner table, suddenly looked vast and empty from this side. But the space I was standing in, her space, was suffocatingly small. I hadn't realized how narrow the runway behind the bar actually was. It was a corridor designed for efficiency, not for two people to stand abreast without touching. The air here was different too. It was humid, heavy with the moisture of 1,000 steamed lattes and the lingering scent of sanitizer. The espresso machine, a gleaming chrome Italian beast that looked sleek from the front, radiated a palpable physical heat from the back. It was a radiator, a hearth, keeping this little strip of territory 10 degrees warmer than the rest of the room. Aurora didn't give me time to adjust to the new climate. She moved past me, her hip brushing against my thigh in the tight space, sending a jolt of static through my jeans. She reached for a stainless steel pitcher, the metal cool and sweating with condensation, and filled it with oat milk. "Here," she said, shoving the pitcher into my hand. "Hold this." I took it. My grip was awkward, stiff. I felt like an imposter holding a surgeon's scalpel. "Wrong," she said immediately. She didn't step back to correct me. She stepped in. She moved behind me, her chest pressing lightly against my back. The contact was tentative at first, then deliberate. She reached around, her arms bracketing mine, and placed her hands over my hands on the pitcher. The sensation was overwhelming. Her hands were hot, dry, and incredibly strong. I could feel the hard ridges of calluses on her palms, the rough patches on her fingertips from years of handling hot ceramics. It was a texture of labor, of absolute competence. My own hands, soft from years of typing and expensive hand lotion, felt fragile, almost useless beneath hers. "You're gripping it like you're trying to strangle it," she murmured, her mouth dangerously close to my ear. "Relax. It's just milk." "I'm trying," I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Try harder," she teased. Her fingers adjusted mine, sliding my thumb into the correct position, molding my grip to match hers. It was a lesson, technically. She was teaching me the mechanics of steaming milk. But we both knew it was a ruse. She wasn't teaching me. She was claiming me. She was wrapping herself around me under the guise of instruction. "Purge the wand," she instructed. She guided my hand to the knob. I turned it. The machine screamed, a sharp, aggressive hiss of pressurized steam that obliterated the silence of the room. The sound was violent and sudden, creating a sonic wall of white noise that effectively cut us off from the rest of the world. In that cone of sound, the intimacy didn't just spike, it exploded. She guided the tip of the wand into the milk. "Surface tension," she said, her voice raised to be heard over the roar, the vibration of her chest humming against my back. "You have to find the sweet spot. Too deep and it screams. Too shallow and it bubbles. You have to ride the line." The double entendre hung heavy in the humid air. I wasn't thinking about aeration or microfoam. I was thinking about the heat of her body, the smell of vanilla and sweat, the way her fingers were interlaced with mine on the cold steel of the pitcher. "Feel that?" she asked, as the milk began to spin in a vortex. "That rumble in the pitcher? That's the texture changing." I felt it. The pitcher was vibrating, heating up rapidly in my hand. But the real vibration was coming from her. She shifted her weight, pressing closer, her thighs slotting between mine, pinning me against the counter edge. The lesson was dissolving. The milk was getting too hot. The pitcher was burning my palm, but I couldn't let go because her hand was clamping mine to the steel. "Aurora," I said. A warning or a plea. I wasn't sure. "Wait," she whispered. "It's not finished." She didn't turn the steam off. She let it scream for another second, the temperature rising, the pressure building, until the pitcher was almost too hot to hold. It was a test of endurance. How long could we stand in the fire? Finally, she reached out with her free hand and twisted the knob shut. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. The steam cleared, leaving us standing there, tangled together, holding a pitcher of scalded milk in a silent, empty room. The pretense of the lesson had evaporated with the steam. The breach was complete. Aurora took the pitcher from my unresisting fingers. The metal was hot, the milk inside ruined, scalded beyond any hope of salvage. She set it down on the drain tray with a sharp, final clatter that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench. The prop was discarded. The lesson was over. The excuse of the coffee, which had served as our buffer for half a year, was officially gone. She turned in the narrow space, her back pressing against the stainless steel sink, effectively trapping me between her body and the espresso machine. The heat from the boiler was radiating against my lower back, but it was nothing compared to the heat coming off her. "You burned it," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, stripped of the teasing edge it held a moment ago. It was low, rough, and intimate. "You didn't tell me to stop," I replied, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. Thicker, deeper. "I wanted to see how long you'd hold on," she admitted. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 6 months, the look wasn't stolen. It wasn't a glance across a crowded room or a reflection in a pastry case. It was direct, unflinching contact at point-blank range. In the harsh, fluorescent light of the back bar, I could see details I had only guessed at from my table in the corner. I saw the tiny scar above her left eyebrow, a faint white line interrupting the skin. I saw the way her pupils had blown wide, swallowing the iris until only a thin ring of dark hazel remained. I saw the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat, a frantic, visible rhythm that betrayed her calm exterior. The air between us seemed to thin out, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the entire atmosphere of the cafe had been sucked into the 6 inches of space separating our bodies. The playfulness was gone. The game of customer and barista, of observer and observed, had dissolved into something terrifyingly real. "I'm not hiding anymore," I said. It was an answer to the accusation she'd made at the table, but it felt like a surrender. "Good," she breathed, "because I'm done chasing you." She moved then, a sudden shift in elevation that caught me off guard. She placed her hands on the counter edge behind her and hopped up, sitting on the narrow strip of stainless steel next to the sink. The movement brought her face level with mine. It changed the geometry of the interaction instantly. She wasn't looking up at me. She was looking right into me. Her knees parted slightly, brushing against my thighs, and the contact sent a shockwave of pure static through my nervous system. The gravity in the room shifted. I felt a physical pull, a magnetic force dragging me forward into the space between her knees. It wasn't a choice. It was physics. I stepped in. My hands, acting on an instinct I hadn't authorized, reached out. They found her waist. The tactile sensation was a study in contrasts. The apron she wore was heavy canvas, rough and utilitarian, stiff with starch and coffee stains. But underneath the sides of the apron, where my thumbs pressed in, I could feel the soft cotton of her t-shirt and the solid, warm curve of her hip bone beneath that. The barrier of the uniform was slipping. I was touching the person, not the employee. Aurora hissed in a sharp breath when I touched her, her hands coming up to grip my shoulders. Her fingers dug into the fabric of my sweater, grounding her, pulling me closer. "This is dangerous," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine. "You know that, right? Once we do this, you can't go back to the wobbly table. You can't just be the regular who orders the oat flat white." "I don't want the coffee," I told her, my hands tightening on her waist, pulling her to the very edge of the counter until our bodies were flush. "I never wanted the coffee." "Liar," she murmured, but there was a smile in her voice now, a soft, breathless sound. "You love the coffee, but I'm better." The distance had collapsed completely. There was no more air, no more space, no more silence. There was just the heat of the machine behind me, the rough canvas under my hands, and the terrifying electric proximity of her mouth inches from mine. The anticipation was a physical weight, a pressure building behind my ribs that demanded release. We were standing on the event horizon of a black hole, and we had already crossed the line. There was no going back to the orbit we had maintained for months. There was only the fall. The kiss didn't start as a question. It started as an answer to a question we had both been asking silently for 180 days. When her mouth finally met mine, the sensation was absolute, a sudden and violent realignment of my entire world. It wasn't soft, and it wasn't polite. It was the frantic, heavy release of 6 months of accumulated pressure, a dam breaking under the weight of a flood. She tasted exactly like I had imagined, only sharper. A complex, heady mix of dark roast coffee, burnt sugar, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. It was the taste of the cafe distilled into a single human contact. Her lips were chapped from the dry air of the shop, warm and demanding, moving against mine with a hunger that matched the desperation clawing at my own throat. The space behind the counter, which had felt cramped a moment ago, suddenly became a battleground for position. My hands tangled in the straps of her apron, pulling her harder against me, needing to erase the microns of distance that still separated our chests. I felt her hands everywhere at once, gripping my shoulders, sliding up into the hair at the nape of my neck, her fingers threading through the strands and tightening, tilting my head back to deepen the angle. We wrestled for leverage in the narrow corridor. Her knee knocked against my thigh, a hard, bony impact that I barely registered through the haze of sensation. I pressed her back until her apron hit the edge of the sink, the stainless steel rattling against the metal buttons of her jeans. She didn't flinch. She just wrapped her legs tighter around my waist, her heels digging into my lower back, anchoring us together. The silence of the empty cafe amplified everything. In the absence of the grinder's whine and the chatter of the lunch rush, the sounds of our intimacy became deafening. The harsh intake of her breath when I bit her lower lip, the rustle of the heavy canvas apron against my wool sweater, the wet, slick sound of our mouths moving together. It all echoed off the polished concrete floors and the glass windows. We were creating our own atmosphere, a dense, humid bubble of noise and heat that existed entirely separate from the city outside. For a moment, time didn't just slow down. It suspended. The streetlights flickering on outside the window, the passing cars, the schedule I had abandoned on my laptop, none of it existed. There was only the terrifyingly vivid reality of her tongue, the heat of the espresso machine radiating against my back, and the smell of vanilla syrup and sweat filling my lungs. It reminded me of the theory of extraction she had tried to teach me. To get the perfect shot of espresso, you need resistance. You need to pack the grounds tight, creating a barrier that the water has to fight to get through. If the water flows too fast, it's weak. If it takes too long, it's bitter. But if the pressure is right, if the resistance is perfect, you get something rich, complex, and heavy. We had spent 6 months packing the grounds, building the resistance, tamping down the desire with layers of professional protocol and silence. And now, finally, the extraction was happening. The pressure had peaked, and what was pouring out was pure, concentrated intensity. It was the perfect shot, pulled after a lifetime of waiting. We broke apart only when the biological imperative to breathe became impossible to ignore. The separation was physical, a tearing of Velcro, leaving a sudden cold void where her body had been pressed against mine. I leaned back against the espresso machine, my chest heaving, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain me. Aurora stayed perched on the counter, her hands resting on my shoulders, her forehead dropping forward to rest against my chest. For a long minute, the only sound in the room was the ragged cadence of our breathing and the low, steady hum of the refrigerators kicking on in the back. The adrenaline was still spiking in my blood, making my fingertips tingle, but the frantic urgency was beginning to settle into a warm, heavy glow. Aurora laughed, a low, breathless sound that vibrated against my sternum. She pulled back, her hands sliding down my arms to rest on my wrists. Her hair was messy, strands escaping the messy bun to frame a face that was flushed and thoroughly kissed. Her lips were swollen, redder than they had been 5 minutes ago, and her eyes were bright, stripped of the exhaustion that had been there at closing time. "So," she whispered, her voice raspy, "that's what happens when you stop hiding behind the laptop." "I wasn't hiding," I defended weakly, reaching up to tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. My hand was shaking, a visible tremor that I didn't bother to suppress. "I was observing." "You were waiting," she corrected, hopping down from the counter. Her boots hit the rubber mat with a solid thud. She smoothed the front of her apron, a purely reflex action that did nothing to restore her professional demeanor. "And now the wait is over, which means the rules have changed." "What are the new terms?" I asked, watching her move. She walked to the grinder, checking the hopper, her movements looser now, less rigid. "No more silence," she said, turning back to face me, leaning her hip against the counter. "No more pretending you're reading spreadsheets when you're staring at my hands. And no more cold coffee. If I make it, you drink it while it's hot. I don't like waste." "Deal," I agreed. The word felt like a binding contract, far more significant than the unspoken one we had just shredded. The atmosphere of the cafe had shifted again. It wasn't the tense, charged air of the confrontation, nor the explosive heat of the breach. It was something quieter, deeper. The shadows stretching across the floor felt protective now, not isolating. The hum of the machinery sounded like a heartbeat. We were the only two people in the world who knew what the air in here tasted like after hours. "I have to lock up properly," she said, though she didn't move towards the door. "Technically, you're trespassing." "Technically, I was invited into the employee area," I countered. "Fair point." She untied her apron, pulling the loop over her head. Underneath, she was just a woman in a black t-shirt, the barista armor discarded on the counter. "Walk me out?" We left the cafe together, the transition back to the real world feeling jarring and abrupt. The cool night air hit my face, drying the sweat on my hairline. I watched her lock the door, the key turning with that familiar heavy click. But this time, I wasn't watching from the corner table. I was standing close enough to brush her arm. She flipped the sign to closed and looked at me, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. We both looked at the dark glass, seeing the reflection of two people standing together on the sidewalk. The regular order, the flat white, the wobbly table, the silence, was dead. I knew with absolute certainty that the coffee would never taste the same again. It would always taste like this, like risk, like vanilla, and like the start of something that couldn't be contained in a ceramic cup. Walking to the car, the city felt recalibrated. Usually, I leave the cafe drained, my brain buzzing with caffeine, but my body completely static. Tonight, the vibration was different. It was a low-frequency hum of connection that settled deep in my chest. The air was crisp, smelling of damp pavement and exhaust, but it didn't chill me. I carried the lingering heat of the espresso machine, and her, under my own ribs. I thought about the architecture of the last 6 months. We treat tension like a stress fracture, a structural flaw in the building that threatens to bring the roof down. We think the silence is a barrier keeping us apart. But listening to her boots echo in rhythm with mine on the concrete, I realized the tension was never a wall. It was a bridge. It was the suspension cable holding the weight while we built the courage to walk across it. The suture of the relationship had held. That's the only way to describe it. We had cut open the polite, sterile surface of our daily transaction, exposing the raw nerve underneath. Instead of bleeding out, the edges had knit together. The connection wasn't just physical, it was foundational. I looked at her profile against the passing streetlights. She wasn't the guarded barista anymore, the master of the machine protected by a counter and an apron. She was Aurora. The mystery of the regular was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying and exhilarating: reality. The risk of breaking the routine had felt massive when I was hiding behind my laptop screen, terrified of losing my safe harbor. But standing on the other side of the breach, The safety of that old routine looked like a prison I had voluntarily locked myself in. The confident explorer knows that the map is not the territory. I had mapped her from a distance for 180 days, analyzing the data points of her movement. But the terrain of actually knowing her, the rough texture of her hands, the taste of burnt sugar on her mouth, the sound of her laugh without the customer service filter, was a landscape I was only just beginning to navigate. For the first time, I wasn't watching the scene from the edge of the frame. I was the focus. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., the bell would chime. I wouldn't go to the wobbly table. I wouldn't hide. I would walk to the counter, lean against the warm tiles, and order. And when she slid the cup across, she wouldn't have to ruin the art to get my attention. She would already have it. The fear is gone, replaced by the thrill. We moved from silent observation to the tangible shock of skin on skin, proving that the safest routines are often just hiding places. The memory of her finger tracing the foam still tingles on my hand, a reminder that some lines are meant to be broken. If you've ever felt that undeniable spark across a counter and wondered what would happen if you finally looked up, subscribe to follow exactly where the tension leads.